everyone. Welcome to another month of Not Reading for Content. It's our second month for translations, and this time around, we are starting The Posthumous Memoirs of Cubas. This is by Joaquim Maria Machado de Assis. Quite the mouthful. By the end of this month, we'll probably have that slipping off the tongue quite nicely, but you might all need to just be patient with us as we work through certain names, phrases, and everything else in between. We're very excited to get into this book, discuss maybe some things that we're anticipating. But before we even get into that, we're going to want to do our bookish bite. And so, my question for you, Danny, is what was the last classic that you read? The reason why I'm asking is because obviously this isn't just a translation, but it is a Brazilian classic. And so, we probably will have to kind of discuss our feelings about that subject.
Well, the last classic that I read was actually Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, which I really enjoyed. But I will say it was way different than I was expecting. And so I think that especially classics that are very, very well known can sometimes get, I mean, it's almost like hype in your head, except for it's hype with context because you've heard people talk about the story, you've seen retellings or movies, or there's so much going on that when I finally did read Frankenstein, I found it to be slow, which I will say is something that I think is indicative of a lot of classics. Indicative is not the right word, but like I feel like a lot of classics have a very slow kind of plotting nature to them. And I just wasn't expecting it. I also expected it to be not scary, but more eerie than it was. It was just kind of matter of fact. I really liked the themes, the discussions that were had throughout the story. I also really enjoyed, and I think this is something that is true of a lot of classics, especially well-known classics, are the little bits and pieces that people will put in the note at the beginning of the book or after the book that will connect life pieces, information about the author that connects back to their stories. I like digging into those things as well. What about you? What was your last classic read?
Well, I think it's actually kind of funny because we do read quite a few books together. We discuss our readings all the time, but I don't think we ever really realized this that we were reading kind of around the same time Gothic classic literature. I wasn't reading Frankenstein, but I remember when you were reading it. And I, not too long afterwards, picked up Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. And that was the first time I had ever read it. I was really excited, but also having some trepidation because I think, like you, I don't pick up classics very often. I'm a bit nervous by the slow pace as well as the language because I feel as though, to a certain extent, it's probably more prevalent in what the 19th century literature that the way a sentence is formed is completely different. We don't speak the same way. And maybe even the characters didn't speak that way that normal people did, but it was kind of the capital L literature of the time. And it just feels really clunky to me and just not as action packed, as you already mentioned. But I was pleasantly surprised that I enjoyed the slow burn tension of Rebecca. I really enjoyed the narrative voice. And it's not that old of a classic. We also have to acknowledge that these women were writing in completely different times. I mean,
Yeah.
Rebecca was published in like the 1930s. I think it was 1936 or something to that extent. It might have been the 1940s. So they have nearly 100 years difference. So that also might be why I didn't find as much difficulty with Rebecca compared to, say, back when I read Frankenstein. So that might be something to also note is that classics from the 20th century, I'm far more comfortable with. Even Victorian era, that works for me. I read Victorian mysteries, decent amount of times, but the earlier in history we get, the more nervous I am and the less likely I am to pick up this book readily, to be honest.
Yeah, I agree. And I like how you mentioned language too. I did that is something that I noticed with Frankenstein and even in my college days when I was reading like Beowulf or the Odyssey, things like that. The language is very different. It's you have to have 100% of your brain focused on the story and really hold on to what the characters are trying to say, because I do feel like things are flipped around or there's
Mm.
different emphasis on things that we don't do in modern day. And so I do think that it makes it a little bit more exhaustive to read classic novels, which is one of the reasons I don't pick them up very frequently. But hopefully this one will be different. Fingers crossed.
Yeah, truly. And it will be interesting because before we even get to the synopsis of this book, both Danny and I were discussing it prior to recording, just trying to compare our editions, see how we would break up this month and how much we would actually be reading with every third of the book to go. And we started realizing there were some differences between our narratives. The titles are slightly different. And that led us to wonder, wait a second, do we have different translators? And we do. Now, Danny, you have access to the audiobook, and the audiobook version is the same translator as my physical copy for my ebook, but your e-copy has different translators. So that'll be interesting as you go into immersion reading to kind of compare these things. And we will have to obviously discuss that throughout the month, especially if we see some really staggering differences or if it feels as though it's been pretty copy and paste, nothing really crazy has been altered. So that's something to keep in mind, especially for those of you who are also grabbing your own copies. You have different translators from the two of us as well. And so we might be juggling quite a few editions within our little book club.
Yeah, I think it's going to be interesting with the physical copy because since I have the audio and the physical copy, I'll be immersion reading it to see how much difficulty I'm gonna have actually immersion reading instead of, just listening or just reading physically. So it might be a book where immersion reading is not a possibility because of the differences, or it could be very similar. We'll see. But it will be fun to kind of find out. I'm curious to see how different they really are because some of the titles that we were reading for the chapters were way off.
So different, like so many words off, completely different concepts being addressed. And we were like, okay, this might take a moment for us all to know which chapter we're actually talking about. And also considering with this being a translation, is that going to help our understanding? Because this book, I think, was published, what, in like 1880? I think in the 1880s, it said in one of the synopses we were looking at. And obviously, we're reading it from a 2025 perspective that would cause us pause, would make us a bit nervous when it comes to syntax, for instance. But the translators might be translating for a modern audience depending on how old our editions are. I think my edition might be 2020. So I could be wrong. It could have been, republished and it could be a much older edition. But that might actually be a point in our favor because even though the original text is probably a much like older version of Portuguese, I would actually be interested to hear it. I don't know if there are any Portuguese speakers out there. I know that our friend Beatrice speaks Portuguese, but she's also from Portugal, which might have some of its differences compared to Brazilian Portuguese, on top of the fact that we're talking maybe almost 150 years ago difference. So language, I can't wait to get into those discussions because it's one of my favorite things. But I do think we have an advantage with this being a translation because they probably are translating for modern audiences, I'm imagining, unless we're dealing with a tried and true one of the original translations in English. And I don't even know when that was first published in English, to be honest.
Yeah, I don't know either.
But honestly, we're getting carried away. And so let's take a step back, return to our normal formula. And Danny, please feel free, read the synopsis to get us even more excited about this book.
Okay, I will do my best. So this says the Posthumous Memoirs of Cubas is written as an autobiography, a chronicle of the erotic misadventures of its narrator. Cubas, who happens to be dead in the pursuit of love and progeny, Cubas rejects the women who want him and aspires to the ones who reject him. In the end, he dies unloved and without heirs. Yet he somehow manages to turn this bitter pill into a victory of sorts. What makes memoirs stand up 100 years after the book was written is Machado's biting humor, brilliant prose, and profound understanding of all the vagaries of human behavior.
Ooh, all right. A nice short, sweet synopsis, but I feel as though there's still a lot to dig into. There's a lot to kind of poke at. It sounds strange, but I love that he's dead. I do enjoy that we have this narrator from the grave and he's just telling his story. So I'm assuming it probably isn't that hard to assume one plus one is two. Talking about an autobiography, it must be a first person POV, which will be interesting to try to follow his voice and see if we enjoy his voice. So, those
Mm.
things are really interesting to me. I am worried about the mentions of his erotic adventures and the fact that there are all these women he's rejecting, supposedly. Meanwhile, there are women he's chasing who don't want him. That seems not something that you and I would be interested in. You're nodding. I think you agree with me. What do you think about the synopsis?
Yeah, there are so many pieces of it that I'm excited for, and some of that is what I've heard about the book. I saw this book mentioned on Murphy Napier's channel, and I really enjoyed the prospect of a dead narrator, but also I think he might be a little bit sassy. Um,
Mm.
and I quite enjoy that if it's done correctly, but I do know that it can be abrasive too, depending on how the author writes this character. But I think that will be very fun to hear someone's opinion of things after they're dead. It's something that I haven't read, I don't think, before. So I'm curious to figure out how that goes. But yeah, the rejection of women, especially rejecting the women who want him and not the ones who reject him. I just I don't know. I don't know. And since it's a classic, there's always the chance that things are not going to have aged well. We'll see.
Yeah. And we have obviously read books with ghosts who have maybe discussed their past lives, regrets, hopes, things that were left undone. And I imagine in his head, he will be reflecting on that. I'm wondering how much growth we might expect, or I could see a humorous narrative where he grows not at all. He's like, nope, I'm dead. It is what it is. There's nothing to learn from because there's nothing I can do after dying. So I could see there being humor in that, but as always, there is the worry that things might not have aged well. And I'm wondering again, because we have a third party involved in this, the translator, how they tackle it. Will we be able to see the changes, especially if they try to smooth over or even erase certain things that haven't aged well? I've seen that before. It's a huge discussion about censorship in a way, how a translator should be presenting works, how true should they be. And yeah, like especially when we're talking about maybe iffy topics, I don't know how we would be able to tell, but that might be an area where if we have an introduction for said work, we should probably read it. Even if our introductions are different, that might shine a light. If there's any footnotes afterwards, that type of thing, that can kind of help us understand just what type of process was done during this particular translation, which should hopefully be interesting.
Yeah, and I think with this being such a short novel too, that I know that looking at the physical book that I have, there is at least a note at the end that I can read. I haven't looked much at the beginning. But I think that we'll have plenty of opportunity to look up some things too if we're a little lost as to what how the book was originally written or the original intent behind the story. Speaking of how short the book is.
I was prepared for this. I was like, all right, why don't you reveal this to them? Because this is another daunting thing about the book.
Yes, as we were discussing, before recording, we found out that this book has 160 page or 160 chapters, and it's only, like, 230 pages.
Mhm.
So, short chapters, friends. If you like short chapters, this might be the book for you. So, in our breakdown, as far as episodes go, for the first episode, we're gonna be reading chapter 1 through chapter 32. But I wanted to tell you before that it is a short book, so you don't think that we've gone off the rails and are reading just an astronomical amount of pages, because we're really not. It's only about 80 pages in the physical copy that I have. So hopefully that won't be too much to expect from you guys. It's about 80 pages an episode. So we hope that you will join us. If you are interested in any of our translated works that we'll be reading this season, please check the description because we'll have our entire schedule down below. And we would love to hear from you guys in the comments. We hope that you're enjoying the read so far. We always love that you guys come along on these journeys with us, and we hope to see you next Friday.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Not Reading for Content. Be sure to check the description for a schedule of our upcoming reads for this season. And for reminders and other updates, you can follow the podcast on Instagram at Not Reading for Content. Where else can listeners find you, Danny?
I have a booktube and an Instagram. Both can be found at danny.dabbles. What about you?
I have the same platforms. My booktube is at Leandra the TBR0, and my Instagram is at Leandra _ the TBR0. Thanks again for listening. Don't forget to tune in next Friday for our next episode.